All right, welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas, and I'm Ken Hicks. We've been talking about liberalism over the past couple of classes. We're going to conclude our discussion of liberalism, looking a little bit at some of these tension points. I've been talking about the extent to which ideologies form coherent, but they're not, they're coherent bodies of thought. But the walls between certain ideologies are not exactly hard and fast. So there's a lot of kind of bleed over. We're going to start a little bit by talking about an essay by Terence Ball, who was a noted political theorist who's written a lot in the area of ideology on libertarianism and sort of the challenges innate to trying to sustain a libertarian way of looking at the world. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Bernie Sanders and the relationship between Bernie Sanders' interpretation of democratic socialism and liberalism. Then we're going to address a really interesting kind of interpretation of liberalism from the Harvard political theorist by the name of Judith Shklar, who wrote an essay called The Liberalism of Fear, which is very widely read. Then a more recent piece by Toby Buckle, the title of which is Alas, the Time Has Come to Throw John Rawls Under the Bus, which is addressing the whole issue of neutrality as a basis for adjudicating conflicts within a liberal framework. And then we'll conclude with just some observations about what liberalism means today. So the first kind of topic we're going to talk about is this essay by Terence Ball, A Libertarian Utopia. So Terry Ball, he's a professor emeritus. Emeritus simply means he's kind of semi-retired at Arizona State University. He was one of the great wave of Minnesota political theorists that came out in the 70s. Ball questions the viability of libertarianism as a way of organizing society. This is something that I've often said. Libertarianism makes a fine kind of code of personal conduct. If you want to follow kind of a libertarian set of precepts, that's perfectly okay. You can lead a meaningful life of sorts being a libertarian. The problem for Ball and for many other political theorists, myself included, is what would happen if all public services were sold for a profit and citizens were treated not as citizens, but rights-bearing citizens, but as consumers. And so, he's really raising questions about whether libertarianism is really a liberal perspective, or whether libertarianism is a variant of liberalism that has kind of left the reservation, if you will. So he begins by saying, what would life be like in this imagined world called Marketopia, where everything is organized around libertarian principles? First and foremost, we have to rely on our imaginations, because no country has ever established itself solely on the framework of libertarianism. So, according to Ball, drugs and prostitution would be legally sold. Human organs would be on the marketplace for people who are in the need for a new liver or kidneys or something like that. All roads would be toll roads, and police and fire protection services would be privately sold for a fee. Blackmail would be legal, and prisons would be reserved solely for transgressions against another person's property rights. I actually posted on this slide some of the Ferengi rules of acquisition. If you've ever watched one of the Star Trek shows, for the Ferengi were largely what the originators of the show kind of believed was an illustration of what libertarianism would look like. So the rule one is, once you have their money, never give it back. Rule number 6, never let family stand in the way of opportunity. Rule number 13, anything worth doing is worth doing for profit. 14, anything stolen is pure profit. 21, never place friendship before profit. 25, fear makes a good business partner. 37, you can always buy back a lost reputation. And 61, never buy what can be stolen. I mean, this kind of highlights this sense in which if you are entirely devoted to the idea of making profit for yourself, then these rules would make sense to you. Media and education in Marketopia, the news and entertainment have effectively merged with a focus on keeping people entertained. People don't want to hear bad news. They want to hear fun and happy news. People that have the money can rent friends and crowds of sycophants. They can follow them around and praise them. Marriage contracts are considered serious affairs and involve extensive negotiation regarding obligations and services. How often should the husband be obliged to take the wife out for dinner? How often should the wife be obliged to provide sexual services and so forth? Family values emphasize negotiation skills and driving a hard bargain. If a mom asks her son, give me a hug and a kiss, the son would say, what's it worth to you? Higher education is entirely financed by large corporations, and marketopians have sacralized libertarian principles, with colleges named after Ludwig von Mises and some of the other wholly Austrian economists. And you kind of have to know a little bit of economics, macroeconomics, to know that the Austrians are a particular libertarian group of people. So he asks, what's wrong with this picture? Markets are indeed a good thing, but they're not the only good thing. And they're not the only way of distributing values. And when you rely purely on markets to distribute everything, you can distort the value of certain things. And that can have really serious, bad consequences, both for individuals and for the community. Marketopia, a society kind of organized around purely market transactions, would represent a massive and systematic violation of a fundamental sense of fairness, according to Ball. The use of language to derange values. Marketopia is not only an unjust society, but an indecent one, where effectively people can literally debase themselves for money. Ball talks about the language of redistribution or redescription that has facilitated a movement towards the marketization of moral, political, and pedagogical discourse. One of the things that I've noted, Elon Musk, I think, is one of the ones that has talked about this quite a bit. And I should mention that yesterday, a conservative activist by the name of Charlie Kirk was shot and killed in Utah. Musk and Kirk were, noted for basically saying that empathy is a made-up word and that it's actually harmful to Western civilization. That we really shouldn't make an attempt to understand other people's perspectives. That is not a good way of looking at the world. Again, I think that when you marketize ethical considerations, think about the things that Donald Trump has done while in office in this second term. I mean, he is literally monetizing the White House. This is what happens when your sole consideration is how much money you can accrue. And so it's a question of choice. Citizens have good reason to be concerned. People who want to be citizens of a good society have a good reason to be concerned about the substitution of the language of citizenship and critical thinking for the language of markets and rampant consumerism. Michael Walzer in 1983, is an American political philosopher, wrote a book called The Spheres of Justice, where he basically says markets are expansive. A radically laissez-faire economy would be like a totalitarian state, dominating every other distributive process. It would transform every good into a commodity. That is a form of market imperialism. So the question that Ball is asking, do market relations constitute the totality of human relations? Now remember, John Locke would say that property ownership is a primordial right, but it is not an absolute one. Locke understood that you needed things like taxation in order to invest in common space. Remember when Ayn Rand said that all public spaces are mausoleums? I don't think that's most human beings' experiences who have ever been to a public park. That's not how we really experience these things. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the connection between liberalism and socialism. We'll be dealing with socialism in more detail in a couple of weeks. But for now, we really need to ask this question. What distinguishes a liberal from a democratic socialist? Because it's very common for opponents of liberalism to basically collapse the two. You heard this last night when Donald Trump was speaking about the death of Charlie Kirk, saying that radical Marxists have demonized people like Kirk and himself by calling them Nazis and fascists. So what is the difference between a liberal and a democratic socialist? Well, let's look at a guy that is a defined, self-identified democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders. He has been around for quite a while. He started his career as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. He was a longtime representative, the sole representative from the state of Vermont. He was eventually elected senator. He has run for president in the last 3 election cycles and basically drawn a very strong following, Berniacs of people who are buying what he is selling. His stock speech really is it emphasizes both the extent to which he is kind of not, there's a reason why he doesn't call himself a liberal, but also why that wall between liberalism and socialism is a little bit more permeable than some liberals would like to say. So he begins by talking about FDR's 1933 inaugural address and how he saw tens of millions of Americans denied basic necessities. He saw millions of families, this is Sanders writing about FDR, or speaking about FDR. He saw millions of families trying to live on income so meager that the pall of family disaster hung over them day by day. He saw millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children. He saw millions acting or lacking the means to buy the products they need, and by their poverty and lack of disposable income, denying employment to millions, to many other millions. He saw millions lacking the means to buy the products they needed and to do the things that they needed. And so he acted. FDR overcame the ferocious opposition of the ruling class. And Sanders believes, and he believed this in 2016 when he first ran for president, that this is what we have to do today. So he basically notes that the New Deal established Social Security, the minimum wage, and unemployment insurance. It abolished child labor, the 40-hour work week. It allowed collective bargaining for unions. It regulated the banks to prevent the constant bankruptcies that were rolling through the country, and created deposit insurance that ensured that people would be able to recoup their losses in the event that their bank failed. All of those things were denounced in their day as socialism by the opposition. And he basically says it was a kind of smear. Today, those programs have become the fabric of our nation and the foundation of a vibrant, struggling middle class. He then talks about the 1960s and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs that were proposed to combat poverty and the lack of access to health care. He notes that Medicare greatly expanded access to quality health care for elderly Americans, that Medicaid provided health care to low-income Americans for the first time, that aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, provided assistance to low-income families with children. All these things were characterized as a threat to the American way of life. And in fact, Ronald Reagan's political career began when he, kind of morphed from being like the family host of American Family Theater to being a paid spokesperson attacking the Medicare bill. Okay? So he's basically pointing to what he characterizes as a very hard truth. Despite huge advances in knowledge and technology, the middle class in America is in decline, and faith in our political system is eroding. The past 30 years have seen a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to the top 0.1% of Americans. Nearly 47 million Americans are living in poverty, and over 20% of American children and 36% of black children are living in poverty. Remember, the speech that Lyndon Johnson gave back in 1965. Black unemployment has really come back to those levels again. Youth unemployment is over 36%. Sociologists can tell you that when young people lack, access to, to work, it's not uncommon for them to resort to crime. They oftentimes make poor choices, and when our economy provides for those things and gets them into an employment cycle where they can start working and earning money, it can save a lot of young people from that temptation. So Sanders calls, and he's echoing FDR's not often, recalled 1945 or 1944 inaugural address, where FDR said, "True individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence." FDR goes on, "People are not truly free when they're unable to feed their family, retire with dignity, lack employment or health care, or are exhausted from working long hours." This was an instance where FDR was steadily moving further to the left than certainly he was in 1932 when we heard about that speech that he gave in the Commonwealth Club, in 1932. So, a decade later and a decade in power, FDR is coming up with a much more vigorous idea of how government needs to intervene in the service of economic equality. That is verging towards what we might call socialism. Sanders goes on, "Our political system has effectively been corrupted by oligarchs." Remember what FDR said. He said the people that are the most insistent that the government be kept out of business are precisely the same people that go to government and say, "I need help," right? He notes that Wall Street spent $5 billion regulating to Congress, lobbying Congress for deregulation. And what did that deregulation get? It got us this, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, and it gave us the subprime mortgage meltdown of the early 2000s. When their greed, corruption, and illegal behavior caused the system to collapse, they used their wealth to get Congress to bail them out. And so Sanders would note, too big to fail also means too big to jail, that they can act with impunity. So what is it that Sanders thinks that we should be pulling for? What does Sanders want to do in the event that he were elected President of the United States? First and foremost, he wanted Medicare for all. He wanted to expand Medicare to radically improve the lives of all Americans and improve the economy as well. Basically, sick people would no longer be chained to jobs that they don't like. They wouldn't have to worry about their deductibles. Business owners would be relieved of the burden of providing employer health care coverage. Workers would no longer be trapped in jobs but could pursue work that they actually love. This is the sense in which, Bernie Sanders sounds a lot more like a democratic socialist than a liberal, right? Here's another couple of things. He's talking about free college and full employment. Today, college is the equivalent of what a high school degree was 50 years ago. Public education in the United States should allow anyone who has the ability, qualifications, that's an important word there, qualifications, and desire to attend a public university or college tuition free. Government should be mandated to do everything feasible to create a full employment economy. Right, to invest, going back to the New Deal and to jobs programs where the government would be the employer. The quote from Sanders: "It makes more sense to put millions of people back to work, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, than to have a real unemployment rate of almost 10%. Now, these are things that, he's saying things that liberals are going to have trouble agreeing with, and that's part of the reason why he didn't win the nomination in 2016. It's part of the reason why he didn't win the nomination in 2020. And what in one sense, and I'll elaborate on this more. In one sense, the main idea for a democratic socialist, and the main point of distinction between a democratic socialist and especially a welfare liberal, would be that a liberal would look, as a welfare liberal would look at Bernie Sanders' diagnosis of the problem related to income inequality and inequality generally, and agree with it and say, yes, inequality is a problem. Inequality retards the ability of individuals to live autonomous lives, right? Where they might differ from Sanders is in saying we want Medicare for all, we want free college tuition, we want an economy that where the government guarantees full employment. Those things would be seen by most welfare liberals, and were actually in the debates, the presidential debates of 2016 and 2020, largely found to be not that receptive on the part of liberals. But the fact that Bernie Sanders did as well as he did in those presidential races reflects the sense in which a lot of Americans who are who are on the left end of the ideological spectrum are as much democratic socialists as they might be liberals, depending on the message that they're hearing. Now, again, I think a lot of those folks who listened to Bernie Sanders and found that his message resonated were also people that voted for Barack Obama, who was, frankly, a liberal. So what is democratic socialism to Bernie Sanders? The wealthiest people in corporations should pay their fair share. What does that mean? It means they should pay more. And probably for Bernie Sanders, they should be paying a lot more. Okay? It means creating a vibrant democracy based on the principle of one person, one vote. That's again something that I think liberals wholeheartedly agree with. That attempts at voter suppression for most liberals are deeply problematical. Bernie concludes, I don't believe government should own the means of production, but I do believe that the middle class and the working class families who produce the wealth deserve a fair deal. That is straight up liberalism right there. The minute he says, I don't believe that the government should own the means of production, he is separating himself from socialism as we would commonly understand it. Most socialists have absolutely no problem with the government owning major industries. If you go to several of the northern European countries, like Norway, for example, the oil industry, part of the reason why their public sector employment is so large is that the oil industry is a government-owned industry. Every amount of profit that comes from Norwegian oil and gas exploration goes to the government. And the Norwegian government uses that to create a really generous welfare state for Norwegian citizens that includes, again, free college education. Now, there's always this caveat when you talk about European countries and free college education. You take tests in those European countries, and if you don't do well on those tests, if you don't score in a upper percentile of those tests, there is no free college education for you. There is free trade school for you. So there is an elitism built into most of these European systems. And the American system, granted, it's very messy. At the same time, it provides an enormous room for redemption, where people who maybe weren't mature enough when they were 18 can go back to school, and if they excel, they can go on to graduate school. Okay. So this is the kind of the starting point where we're beginning to tease out these distinctions between liberalism and socialism. And in a couple of weeks, when we get to socialism proper, we'll be able to draw on that a little bit more. We're going to move next to another articulation of liberalism, and this is more of a minimalist view. This was advanced by the late Judith Shklar, who was one of the political theorists I most respected from the 20th century. So who was Judith Shklar? She was a Latvian Jew who, when the Soviet Union took over Latvia in the 1920s, she fled first to the United States, then to Canada. She attended McGill and then on to a women's college in the United States where she took on a PhD. She was one of the first women to join Harvard's faculty in 1956. She was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant political theorists of her generation. In 1989, she became the first woman to be elected as president of the American Political Science Association. Her most notable contribution to political theory is this idea of the liberalism of fear. And that is her sense. It's a through line of all of her work, which is that cruelty is the worst thing that we can do to one another, and that our politics should be dedicated to minimizing cruelty. Okay? So she notes first and foremost that the word liberal and liberalism has been overused and misused and overextended to the point where liberalism often doesn't mean what we think it means. Centuries of ideological conflict has deranged the essential meaning of liberalism. And so for Judith Shklar, liberalism refers to a political doctrine rather than a philosophy of life. And one of the reasons why I respect her so much, there is this tendency within political theory, or there are two types of political theorists. There are the folks who think they can build a system that will create an answer for everything. I call them architectonic theorists. And then there are folks who are basically saying we need to be clearer about what we mean when we are saying certain things. And these are what I call the concept clarifiers, the analytical theorists, who are more interested in putting ideas in front of people in ways that they can use it more clearly. And so for Shklar, liberalism has only one overriding aim: to secure the political conditions that are necessary for the exercise of personal freedom. Now that was highly aspirational in the 16th and 17th centuries. Today, we almost take our individual freedoms for granted. And so a quote from her: "Every adult should be able to make as many effective decisions without fear or favor about as many aspects of his or her life as it is compatible with like freedom of every other adult." So in other words, we should be freedom maximizers, we should be autonomy maximizers, right up to the point where giving someone maximum freedom results in them being able to take away freedom from others. When you think about the fact that we are approaching a situation where there are individuals who are likely to become trillionaires in the next several years, that reflects something that she's talking about. So critics have argued basically that liberalism is the equivalent of modernity. And she hastens to say that that is not the case. Liberalism is not the repository of everything that has happened after the Renaissance. It is an imperfect mixture of natural science, technology, industrialization, skepticism, loss of religious orthodoxy, disenchantment, nihilism, and atomistic individualism. She's lumping in the good with the bad, right? Importantly, liberalism has been very rare, both in theory and practice, over the last 200 odd years. She makes a great note of this in another essay called Redeeming American Political Philosophy, where she basically says there was not a lot of liberalism on the ground when the framers of our Constitution were negotiating over the framework of our government. In fact, they were not liberals. They were Republicans. They believed in limited government, which is an important aspect of liberalism, but it's not a sine qua non of liberalism. That's a fancy Latin word for without which not. She makes the argument, the United States was not a liberal state until after the Civil War, and even then, often in name only. She notes, we had the horrors of the Civil War, which led to what many historians have described as the second founding, with the ratification, the passage and ratification of the Civil War amendments. We got rid of chattel slavery. We basically said that the states could no longer discriminate with the 14th Amendment. We gave black males the right to vote with the ratification of the 15th Amendment. But even then, from 1871 until well into the 20th century, conservatives and non-liberals were nevertheless able to manipulate the legal and constitutional frameworks in ways that persisted in decidedly anti-liberal ways. I think Shklar and many liberal political theorists would make the argument that we did not genuinely become a liberal nation until the mid-1960s. The relationship between liberalism and religion is often characterized as a fraught one, and liberals are often characterized as being anti-religion. Shklar would say, well, first and foremost, liberalism does not rest on any specific religious or philosophical system of thought. Liberalism does not have to choose among religious creeds as long as those creeds do not reject toleration. Toleration is a sine qua non of liberalism. You have to accept a degree of tolerance in order to be a liberal. No theory that gives public authorities the unconditional right to impose beliefs and even a vocabulary as they see fit upon the citizenry can be described as remotely liberal. This is fundamentally a lot about what we're fighting about today. A significant aspect of our culture wars is one side basically saying there can only be a man and a woman. There can be no transgender care. Woke is now illegal, as we found out in Texas, where the president of Texas A&M fired a teacher, a dean, and a department head and a dean because the teacher was teaching a class on children's literature that included a presentation on diversity. So Shklar argues that for liberalism there is a line, especially the liberalism of fear that she is articulating here. There is a line that must always be drawn. Liberalism rejects political doctrines that do not recognize the difference between public and private. Because without private, you cannot have personal autonomy. She argues that where the line is drawn is less important than that the line exists. Again, a quote from her. It is a shifting line, but not an erasable one. And it leaves liberals free to espouse a very wide range of philosophical and religious beliefs. It's the line between public and private that allows liberalism to be a big tent, to say we can put up with a lot of stuff as long as there is tolerance and so long as there is this recognition between public behavior and private behavior. She notes the relationship between liberalism and skepticism. There is a kind of psychological connection. Liberals are inclined to be tolerant, to advocate tolerance among competing, conceptions of what constitutes a good life. This is where a lot of this argument about neutrality that John Rawls talks about. We talked about this in the previous discussion. Skeptics are more likely to prefer a government that does nothing to increase the levels of fanaticism and dogmatism among its citizens. And as an example, she notes Federalist number 10, that freedom, that giving people freedom resolves many factional conflicts. Freedom within a large political community creates the zone where people can operate with, relatively free of other restraints, and where you can adopt this kind of live and let lived approach to life. For Shklar, skepticism is not a necessary condition for liberalism, but it helps, right? And of course, there is a very important distinction between skepticism and cynicism. What is the difference, you may ask? A skeptic would say, how do we know what we know? Show me your work. Give me proof. Offer me arguments. A cynic would say, it doesn't matter. The game is rigged. Cynics embrace conspiracy theories. Skeptics want to be persuaded. Cynics cannot be persuaded. That so much of our political discourse has verged off into cynicism is a significant part of what is troubling our politics, because we literally are not talking to one another. Liberalism and science. Originally, the relationship between liberalism and science was an alliance of convenience. She makes the argument that the natural sciences are most likely to flourish under conditions of freedom. She contrasts that with art. Art oftentimes flourishes in moments of oppression, because artists can draw on the derangements of political suppression to highlight the paradoxes inherent in any repressive system. For Shklar, the shared enemy of liberalism is censorship. When we tell people what they can and cannot think and believe, it fundamentally impedes their freedom, and it fundamentally retards science. Think about when Donald Trump, RFK Jr. is firing members of the scientific community, accusing them of having lied about the COVID crisis. I fully accept that the public health community made mistakes during the COVID-19 crisis. I refuse to accept that the entire medical community was engaged in some kind of sustained cover-up for some partisan end. Most scientists I know are simply not interested in politics. And we're witnessing the disaggregation of one of our main public health institutions in the Centers for Disease Control. They're going to have fundamental problems tracking diseases because of the actions of this administration. The relationship between liberalism and tradition is actually quite similar to its relationship between the relationship between liberalism and religion. Liberals, however, are doctrinally required to reject certain traditions. No society, this is Shklar again, no society that still has traces of the old tripartite division of humanity into those who pray, those who fight, and those who labor can be liberal. Liberalism insists on the idea that the child of a laborer can become a scientist or a president. But liberals are not obliged to forego all traditions. Many liberals exist solidly within religious and philosophical traditions. They need not decide among those traditions that are not hostile to individual autonomy. The traditions of representative government and volunteerism in the United States and the United Kingdom are more than merely compatible with liberalism. They are the soil out of which liberalism grew. The liberalism of fear talks a lot about the liberalism of personal development as well, the necessity of freedom for personal and social progress. Morality is impossible without choice. We cannot benefit from education unless our minds are free to accept and reject what we are told and to read and hear the greatest variety of opposing opinions. This is one of the problems I have with contemporary education, that that oftentimes it's not indoctrination per se, but there is a certain intolerance that has bled into certain areas of academia. I think we should always be prepared to hear what people have to say. I have a colleague who wanted to write his dissertation on, how I'm trying to remember the specifics of it. It escapes me, but in any event, his dissertation director, who was sort of in that field, basically said, "No, you can't provide a white person perspective on this particular issue." And I was like, "That's not right. That is the suppression of inquiry." As academics, we should be guiding, not strangling how people explore the issues that they want to explore. Again, we're getting back to this issue of cruelty. Okay, Shklar notes that torture was once commonplace. It has gradually been reduced as a routine governmental practice, and over the course of the 20th century, international laws were created designed to reduce torture. This is an incredible quote. Again, this was written in 1989. We say never again, but somewhere someone is being tortured right now. And acute fear has again become the most common form of social control. I think that statement resonates more now today than it even did in 1989. So what are the basic units of political life for the liberalism of fear? She's basically saying that for her, the basic units of political life are not discursive and reflecting persons, nor friends and enemies, nor patriotic citizens, soldier citizens, nor energetic litigants, but the weak and the powerful. She's basically saying that our political regime revolves around how the powerful behave toward the weak. Do they nurture them and give them opportunities, or do they exploit them? And for her, the liberalism of fear is guided by this sense that the abuse of public power in all regimes is equally bad and most likely to fall most heavily on the poor and the weak. Shklar argues that her liberalism of fear is more than simply negative freedom, and this is an important distinction that was drawn by the British political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He drew the issue between positive liberty, the sense in which we have a sense of purpose and a sense of need, and government might have a sense of need. We talked about this in an earlier presentation related to T.H. Green. But also between negative liberty, and that is this sense in which we are free from restraint. And so she's basically making the argument that there is more to it than simply removing restraints. There is an important distinction between open doors, simply saying the door is open, you can walk through it, versus setting the conditions of liberty. And by that she's referring to the social and political institutions that make personal freedom possible. Okay? There have to be norms that restrain powerful people from intervening, even with the best of intentions, in people's lives. At best, a liberal, and certainly a liberal like Shklar would say, we should be providing people with the opportunities that they should positively embrace. But if they don't positively embrace it, we should not be in the position of forcing them to be free, a la some Rousseauian vision of socialized community. And again, this reflects a difference between a liberal and a communitarian, who would basically say, in order to have community, we have to make people belong to a community. So again, she's saying this is a negative, but a necessary but not sufficient condition. Limited government and the control of unequally divided power creates these environments where we need these conditions of liberty to be in place. And and I would say today, the conditions of liberty are under assault. And so she's basically making the argument that simply having an open door in front of you is an empty metaphor in the absence of dispersal of political power. Where people don't have authority, they have little control over their lives. She's also arguing that this is not simply a contentless, political framework. The liberalism of fear does not rest on a theory of moral pluralism. It does not offer, this is a Latin phrase, a summum bonum, which is Latin for the highest good, toward which all political agents should strive. We should allow people to go the direction they want to go, in faith that they'll go in a direction that will work to the benefit of the community, broadly speaking. She says it may not offer a summum bonum, but it certainly does begin with a summum malum, which is Latin for the highest evil, which all of us know and would avoid if only we could, and that is that evil is cruelty, and the fear it inspires, and the very fear of fear itself. Now, as someone who places cruelty at the center of her political philosophy, she has to say what it is that she means by it. And she is not talking about mere sadism, right? Which is, again, the individual tendency to indulge in the infliction of cruelty on others. She also, even as she notes, Shklar, sadistic individuals may flock to occupy positions of power that permit them to indulge their urges, which you note with the Nazi regime in fascist Germany or within the regimes in the Soviet Union. The cruelty she refers to is the deliberate infliction of physical harm upon a weaker person by stronger ones to achieve some end. The problem of systematic fear is this: we fear a society of fearful people. Think about what's going on in Gaza right now. It is being justified by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and I don't believe that Netanyahu speaks for all Israelis. But the government of Benjamin Netanyahu is basically saying we cannot suffer for Gaza to exist so long as we live in fear. Any possibility of another October 7th is a possibility that justifies whatever we're doing right now. Fearful people do terrible things. And that's really a deep insight that, again, this was written in 1989. It is as relevant today as it was then. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is driven by fear, by the sense in which Russia fears that a westward, looking neighbor with a vibrant economy and an open society would be a threat to their way of life. Where the instruments of coercion are at hand, Shklar writes, it is the task of liberal citizenry to see that not one official can intimidate anyone. And again, this just resonates so strongly with me today. So what are the objections to the liberalism of fear? There is a reductionist criticism, the idea. Now, reductionism is a philosophical idea that you can break down complex phenomenon into their constituent parts. In this sense, reductionism is offered as a criticism, basically saying that focusing on cruelty leads you to ignore or be silent on many equally important issues. So the criticism is that in putting cruelty first, Shklar is ignoring many of humanity's most noble aspirations. For Shklar, the argument is, that to call the liberalism of fear a lowering of one's sights implies that emotions are inferior to ideas and especially to political causes. It may be noble to pursue ideological ambitions or risk one's life for a cause, but it's not noble to kill another human being in pursuit of one's own causes. There's also the instrumentalist criticism. The accusation of instrumentality amounts to disdain for those who do not want to pay the price of utopian ventures, least of all those invented by other people. Again, this is this idea that government should not always be saying where people ought to be going. And that the more government tries to do that, the more it deranges people's lives. And then there is the claim that the liberal view of citizenship is ahistoric and ethnocentric. In other words, it does not draw on any specific historical conception. And it likewise, it is focused solely on one specific aspect of human nature. That in that sense, the Anglo-American experience. Sklar acknowledges that liberalism did emerge at a specific time and place, but argues that such criticisms assume that humans would naturally choose an oppressive culture to an alien liberalism offering individual rights and personal liberty. Sklar writes, asserts admittedly without evidence that the Chinese did not really like Mao's regime any more than we would, in spite of their political and cultural distance from us. I think she's probably right. The liberalism of fear is innately suspicious of ideologies of solidarity. And again, in that sense, she is referring both to socialism and to certain brands of conservatism, and certainly of fascism. Liberalism need not speculate on the potentialities of this or that self, this or that idea related to human nature. Liberals do not need to account for actual political conditions. Liberals must be suspicious of communitarian ideologies that appeal to those who find liberalism emotionally unsatisfying. She writes, to seek emotional and personal development in the bosom of a community or in romantic self-expression is a choice open to citizens in liberal societies. This is certainly true. Here in Oklahoma, many people live their lives vibrantly through their churches. Both, however, are apolitical impulses and wholly self-oriented, which at best distract us from the main task of politics when they are presented as political doctrines, from the main and distract us, when they, again, when at worst, under unfortunate circumstances, they can inflict serious damage on liberal practices. Again, she's prepared to say you can live an illiberal life within a liberal society right up to the point where you start damaging the liberal underpinnings of society, attacking fundamental norms related to tolerance and rule of law. Does the liberalism of fear amount to anarchism? Sklar rejects that accusation, again, noting the deficiencies of anarchist accounts in defending rights. We talked about this earlier in this discussion with Ball's argument, which is to say, in an anarchist society, in a libertarian anarchist society especially, where you still have a functioning economy, people with money can basically exploit other people, and there's no sanction involved. There is no crime in exploiting other people for your personal gain or your personal enjoyment. Importantly, the actualities of countries where government and law have broken down are not encouraging. Go to, many countries in Asia, in Africa, in parts of Latin America, and see what anarchy and chaos is like. Go to Haiti. She writes the question, and in 1989, this was a terrible thing. Does anyone want to live in Beirut? You can ask that question today. Does anyone want to live in Haiti, where gangs control Port-au-Prince and many of the other towns? The original first principle of doctrine, the rule of law, remains perfectly intact, and it is not an anarchistic doctrine. Anarchy is corrosive of rule of law, because it rejects the idea that any law can bind the autonomous person. So again, this was written 36 years ago, and I think it's an incredibly vibrant argument. But it's not a neutral argument. It's not an argument that's saying that we should be indifferent to basic arguments, to basic views of how people should live their lives. It's saying if you want to be a devoutly religious person, if you want to go to church 3 times a week, that is your freedom. That is your right to do that. You can't use your religious convictions to take away rights of other people. That is the essence of what Shklar is talking about. So now we're going to move on to an essay by Toby Buckle, Liberals. Alas, the time has come to throw John Rawls under the bus. Now remember, we talked about Rawls 2 presentations ago, and this is again a 1970s really seminal work within liberal political theory. A Theory of Justice. It was written in 1973. I ended up going through 2 paperback editions. I literally got it assigned it so often. I read it so many times. The spine broke on my first book, and I had to buy another one. And the essence of that argument is this notion of justice as fairness. And basically what Rawls is saying is that liberals can be neutral with regard to basic governing principles. This is an argument that is increasingly coming under attack in contemporary political theory. And so Buckle argues that liberals were caught off guard by the resurgence of authoritarianism and fascism and related kinds of anti-liberal thought. Liberalism did not cause, he says this at various points in this essay, liberalism did not cause or provoke the backlash. The problem is that liberal elites did not understand itself, or to the extent that it did, it understood itself in philosophically confusing ways. And so the idea of neutrality really emerges kind of late in the 20th century. And Buckle is clear to say that liberalism's origins were clearly articulated as focusing on personal liberty. It had a stance. Early liberals like John Locke were revolutionary in a literal sense, invoking social contract theory as a justification for overthrowing absolutist monarchs. Likewise, the liberals, the values of mid-20th century liberals were very clearly articulated. Liberals were going to save the world from fascism, and they were going to fight, abroad, and they were going to fight economic equality and discrimination at home. The picture on this slide is a classic kind of mid-20th century liberal, a guy named Henry Scoop Jackson. Served as a senator from Washington State for 30 years. He was a quintessential Cold War liberal, fundamentally hostile to the Soviet Union, to Soviet authoritarianism, to Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. He supported the Vietnam War to the very end, but he also supported civil rights at home and supported many of the New Deal programs of that era. Buckle writes about the long 90s, which really reflects this period in the middle of the 20th century when liberalism and New Dealism, especially as a manifestation of liberalism, began losing steam. Especially as you get to the civil rights era, you see a fundamental fracturing of the New Deal coalition. This is important to keep in mind. When you govern, you are choosing in ways that are liable to potentially alienate key elements of any constituency that enables you to govern. The New Deal coalition was an enormous electoral coalition that Democrats were able to wield to great effect from 1932 until 1968. And 1968 is sort of an artificial cutoff because that's really when you see Richard Nixon get elected. But what really happened was in 1965 when you get this, the Voting Rights Act, the Clean Air Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. A lot of regulatory policy gets enacted that begins alienating key elements of that constituency, especially Southern Democrats. Nixon's Southern strategy and the rise of Reaganism from the 1960s into the 1980s reflects this fundamental kind of loss of consensus among Americans regarding liberalism. You begin seeing like the construction workers' riots in the 1970s against leftists, what they were characterizing as leftist hippies. And then you get, economic challenges from stagflation in the late 1970s to the mortgage meltdown of the early aughts. And you had a period that we characterized as the long 90s, which was a period of economic stability and steady expansion, where you had conservatives that were gaining ground, but they were still working within a liberal framework, and they worked within that framework. They were not attempting to overthrow the liberal framework in that period. So you basically had a muting of the overtly racist appeals that had driven American politics in the early 20th century. And again, conservatives were able to exploit the language of neutrality. I'll give you a quick example because I've still got a number of slides to go and I'm running out of time. The guy pictured on this slide is Lee Atwater. He was he ran elections in South Carolina. He was a key element of Ronald Reagan's campaign. He was a key element of George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign. And he was a Southern man, and he used the N-word very frequently early in his electoral career. In an interview towards the end of his career, he actually had brain cancer and was died very suddenly. But he basically acknowledged that, we could not use overt racist appeals the way we were able to do early in the 1970s. We couldn't get away with it. And so we had to resort to dog whistles. We had to resort to, the deployment of wedge issues. And that was, effective at mobilizing Southern whites and moving Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It's instructive. In the 1940s, the South was uniformly Democratic. But what happened over the course of the 70s and the 80s was whites overwhelmingly became Republican. And many black Southerners who had been Republicans in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then moved to the Democratic Party as a result of the Truman Fair Deal proposals. They stayed in the Democratic Party. They had been Republicans before, then they became Democrats and persisted. And what you consistently see when you study voting patterns is that you'll see 95% of white Mississippians that vote for Republicans and 95% of blacks that are voting for Democrats. And so he characterizes this period as an age of neutrality, where again, liberals are attempting to say we're just like the umpire, we're just calling balls and strikes. Now, Buckle admits that that while Rawls exerted influence, his influence was practically limited. Rawls's belief in neutrality as a fundamental basis for establishing justice without appealing to comprehensive doctrines, religion, or any kind of other perfectionist ideological perspective, was again widely kind of shared, but it was a soft conviction. Right? There was the soft egalitarian of liberal elites and the willingness, again, of conservatives to twist neutrality in the service of inegalitarian ends. And you can look at that with, for example, what was the guy's name? He was, I'll just put it in general terms because I can't remember the guy's name. But when you look at antitrust regulation in this period of time, increasingly, the judicial judgments were not that antitrust, that monopolization is the problem, but that consumer protection is the problem. So long as a monopoly is not harming consumer interests, the monopolies can persist. And as a result of that, you get Amazon. You get, and now you get these massive social media platforms. that are dominating entire sectors of the economy. And so Buckle points clearly to why neutrality fails. And he points to a specific Supreme Court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the court attempted to adopt a reasoning that could accommodate both pro-choice and pro-life positions. Reasonable people will disagree. Well, the reality is that abortion is not an issue where two reasonable people can disagree with the outcome but accept the legitimacy of the process. The abortion debate is fundamentally about what kind of constitution we should have. The pro-choice position established under Roe versus Wade was that a living woman had constitutional priority over their physical autonomy where it related to a pregnancy. The pro-life position has asserted that the unborn have a constitutional right that displaces the autonomy of women. It's really that simple. And to the point now where the pro-life position is that a fetus is not a fetus, it's a baby. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 week, 5 weeks, they call it a baby because that is how they want to frame the debate. And so the abortion debate demonstrates the existence of issues where neutral political frameworks utterly fail because of the zero-sum nature of the issue. To give constitutional protection for women over their reproductive rights is necessarily a loss for people who believe that abortion is murder. There is no way of escaping that political reality. There is no neutral framework that can mollify both sides. Someone will have to win this debate. Someone will have to lose it. And so this is creating cracks within the liberal consensus. And he points to Barack Obama. Barack Obama was an amazingly talented politician. But the consistent through line of his time as a senator and as a presidential candidate and as a two-term president was this something that he articulated in a speech at the Democratic National Convention in 2004, which was, there is not a red America or a blue America, there is a United States of America. And the problem that Buckle points to is that there is a reasonably large percentage of white Americans that did and do hold views and values that cannot be addressed within a liberal framework of reasoned and empathetic discussion. And it is, I think, a point that cannot be contended, that without Barack Obama's presidency, you would not have a presidency of Donald Trump, because having a black president antagonized a significant portion of white Americans, of white voters. People who had not been voting turned out to vote in antipathy of Barack Obama's administrations. And so we increasingly are living in what Buckle characterizes as the age of the unreasonable. The long 90s fell apart at once and then bit by bit. It has created a decidedly anti-liberal environment where you have a vice president of the United States who is, basically, again, characterizing liberal institutions of education as evil, as indoctrinators that should be destroyed. Buckle basically is arguing that in such an anti-liberal environment, neutrality simply cannot exist as an elite practice. Liberal elites were caught off guard and have found themselves fighting a war they were not prepared mentally or structurally to fight. Liberalism of any interpretation has values at its foundation. And he points to this idea of masculinity as an illustration. On this slide is a picture of Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, who he wrote a book on masculinity, basically saying that this is a commonplace. This is a commonplace among conservatives. It is a commonplace among people in the Silicon Valley alt-right communities. That there has to be a certain vision of masculinity. That masculinity comes in a certain form. That you have, that you work out. That you are forceful. That you are heterosexual. and that is what men should look like, and that if we don't allow that, we are allowing the death of America. The liberal response shouldn't be to construct a liberal version of masculinity. Liberals should reply that being a man is about freedom to choose. Liberals should want men to choose their lives, not because liberal is neutral about it, but precisely because it's not, because we believe that men have the freedom to decide what's good for them, that we lead happier lives when we can form our own characters, pick our own hobbies and interests, rather than being forced into a narrow little masculine box. So Buckle is basically saying that they have to take their own side of an argument. The liberal denunciation of fascism's society-destroying depravity must be matched by a hopeful, compassionate, and vibrant narrative about the lives we want people to live. And again, it's a sense in which it's a life that you get to choose. We want to make sure, as a liberal, I'm speaking from a liberal perspective here, liberals want people to be able to say, we want you to have the information you need to live a meaningful, autonomous life. The new rights vision essentially boils down to the demand that we make ourselves small, that we return to rigid gender roles, that LGBTQ identities be suppressed, that our society be cleansed of foreign influence, that we only partake in what some reactionary elite determined to be authentically American. Following such a diminished vision, according to Buckle, is wrong, not because it violates some neutral constitutional balancing act, but because it is essentially inhuman. So, let me conclude. Liberalism today. There are wide differences among liberals as to what we should be doing. Again, there are differences and divisions. Liberalism is no longer the revolutionary force it was in the early modern era, at least until and unless it is able to revitalize itself. Liberals remain fundamentally divided between welfare and neoclassical visions. Liberals confront serious challenges related to prioritizing personal autonomy while ensuring equality of opportunity. So again, what is the proper role of government from a liberal perspective? For political liberals, the job of government is to preserve justice and protect individuals' right to live as they see fit, but not to promote a particular vision of the good. Other liberals contend societies depend upon citizens who are rational, tolerant, far-sighted, and committed to the common good, and a good government will necessarily encourage people to develop and display concern for the common good. There is an evolving controversy over affirmative action. There is an ongoing, argument over what constitutes a liberal community. So as an ideology, liberals explain the world in terms of individuals and their rights. They evaluate the world in terms of how many rights people have. They orient themselves as rights-bearing individuals. Who again are able to form, associations as they see fit. And their advocacy, again, is for those programs that promote equality of opportunity, but also of maximizing personal autonomy. Liberalism is not synonymous with democracy, but it has moved steadily in a democratic direction, since the 19th century. Liberals support democracy because democracy is the most reliable means of protecting individual rights and developing individuals' capacity for self-governance. Liberalism promotes reasonable tolerance. Liberals are obliged to tolerate those things which do not threaten the fundamental underpinnings of liberal society. And I'm going to close on that note. When we come back, we're going to take up conservatism. What does it mean to be conservative? I want you guys to hold me to account here. I want you guys to believe that I am offering you the best understanding of these different visions of conservatism. I'll see you next time.